Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Reformed Thinking. We have an incredible stack of sources today that isn't focused on the latest technology or some obscure historical fact. It's about synthesizing the single largest, most continuous narrative structure in recorded history, the story of the Old Testament.
That's right. And our source material today provides this really comprehensive high-altitude summary. It looks at the entire Old Testament narrative, from creation through the covenant to the final prophetic utterances, and it does it through three critical lenses: covenant faithfulness, inevitable judgment, and the glorious promise of the coming king.
So our mission today is pretty substantial. We're trying to distill the big picture of the OT. We're looking for that continuous thread that links the initial creation, the devastation of the fall, the exile, and then the promised restoration. And crucially, we're focusing on how the prophets acted as these expert guides, helping Israel understand the true meaning and direction of their own, well, chaotic history.
And the sources are very clear that for this narrative to make any sense at all, you have to have a starting point. And that point must be the absolute reign of Yahweh over all creation. This rule is applied equally to his governance, in judging Israel for their failures, and ultimately in saving his people through promise. The whole prophetic message really hinges on grasping that God is the sovereign king, even, or maybe especially, when he is administering punishment.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The function of the prophets. They weren't just fortune tellers predicting the future. They were more like forensic analysts of the past and present, right? Giving a deeper understanding of Israel's journey.
That's the key distinction. The core function of the pre-exilic prophets, guys like Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, it wasn't to move the historical storyline forward. The narrative books were already doing that. Their role was supplemental. They provided this crucial, deeper insight into the motivation behind Israel's actions and clarified the spiritual meaning of the history being recorded. They interpreted the signs of the times, but they did it based on the foundational agreement Israel had made with Yahweh.
And the judgment they warned about wasn't just some random arbitrary thing. It was literally written into the contract, the foundational document of their relationship with God.
Precisely. The central terrifying threat of judgment was expulsion from the land. It was exile. This punishment was laid out in the covenant stipulations with crystal clarity. If Israel, after being delivered from Egypt and placed in the land, their new Eden, failed to obey their covenant Lord, they would be evicted. We see this threat articulated so powerfully in Leviticus 26, which details this cascading series of escalating judgments. And it gets even more severe in Deuteronomy 28, which lists curses that culminate in the people being plucked off the land.
Yeah.
So this wasn't a surprise attack. It was the inevitable legal consequence of violating the agreement with their king.
What's just staggering is that despite these clear warnings, the people fundamentally misunderstood what judgment meant for them. They had this overly optimistic, almost nationalistically arrogant view of the future.
They absolutely did. Israel and Judah were guilty of a really dangerous misreading of the day of the Lord. They saw this day strictly as a time of vindication for themselves, a time of salvation and prosperity, and a final judgment for the Gentile nations who oppressed them. They believed their status as God's chosen nation automatically insulated them from divine wrath.
Which is a belief that required a very sharp correction. The prophets essentially had to turn Israel's own religious hope against them.
Oh, it was a crushing message.
Yeah.
The prophets, especially Amos, stated flatly that because the people were living in ways that perfectly mirrored the pagan nations around them, neglecting justice, oppressing the poor, practicing idolatry, the day of the Lord would be the precise opposite of what they hoped. It would be a day of darkness, not light, filled with gloom, not rejoicing unless they repented, and radically. Amos asks, "Why do you desire the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light." That realization would have been seismically terrifying to the original audience.
And the sources spend a good amount of time detailing the deep spiritual sickness that just permeated the leadership structure.
That's right. Every level was compromised. Prophets were indicted for speaking falsehoods, for promising comfort when destruction was right around the corner. Priests were indicted for failing to teach the law correctly. Kings were indicted for corruption and idolatry. They were all acting as bad shepherds, promising peace when disaster is imminent. This showed that the covenant failure wasn't just a grassroots issue. It began at the very top and infected the whole society.
But the defining sin, the one that the prophets used the most evocative language for, wasn't just breaking a single law. It was described as whoredom or treachery. That term comes up over and over in Hosea, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel.
And that term really defines the nature of the relational violation. It signifies spiritual adultery. Israel's sin was not just violating a law, it was abandoning the Lord. the one who had sustained them, nurtured them, delivered them, provided everything they needed because they found him boring. They actively sought excitement, security, and material comfort in other gods, like Baal, or in foreign political alliances with Egypt or Assyria.
The imagery that Hosea uses is particularly vivid here, isn't it? I mean, he was forced to live out the treachery of Israel in his own marriage.
Yes, Hosea's life became a living metaphor for Israel's relationship with Yahweh. His wife, Gomer, repeatedly ran off to find other lovers, believing they were the ones providing the food, wine, and wool that Yahweh was actually providing all along. And this just mirrored Israel's foolishness. They attributed God's blessings to idols and chased after false security, preferring a fleeting thrill over the steady, self-giving fidelity of their true husband.
So the exile, the eviction of the northern kingdom in 722 BC and then Judah in 586 BC, it was less about military defeat and more about the inevitable consequence of forsaking the king. It was all laid out in those foundational covenant documents.
That is the prophetic insight. Their disobedience meant they could not remain in their new Eden. God, as the righteous king, had to enact a prescribed judgment. The prophets provided the clarity. The exile was not an accident of geopolitical fortune, but a necessary, foretold covenant judgment that demonstrated Yahweh's reign is absolute and his word is true.
But the narrative doesn't just end with destruction. Despite the dire reality of judgment and exile, the source material pivots pretty swiftly to the certainty of salvation. The story of God's people is not allowed to end with eviction.
It can't end there, because Yahweh's sovereignty works in two directions: judgment and salvation. He had not abandoned his people, and those inviolable promises made to Abraham centuries earlier were still scheduled for fulfillment. The promise that the offspring of the woman would one day triumph over the serpent, the promises to Abraham offspring land, worldwide blessing, and the critical promise of a king from David's line, all of these remain secure because God himself guaranteed them.
So the immediate promise given to the people in exile was this idea of a new exodus. Now that sounds like a physical return to the land, but the sources imply something much deeper than just a travel itinerary. How does the new exodus differ qualitatively from the original one?
That's a great question. The prophets guaranteed a return to the land, yes, but this event would be qualitatively greater than the original exodus from Egypt. In the first exodus, God used a mediator, Moses, and the journey took 40 years. In the new Exodus, Yahweh pledged that he would personally go before the nation to bring them back to Israel. Isaiah describes this new road as smooth, straight, and spectacular, ensuring the people wouldn't face permanent separation. It symbolizes not just freedom from Babylon, but freedom secured by God's own presence.
But the restoration promised by the prophets goes far beyond just a return trip and rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. It involves a kind of cosmic overhaul, the new creation.
And this is where the scope of the promise just expands exponentially. The Lord pledges a new creation that physically and spiritually surpasses the original Garden of Eden. The transformation is comprehensive. It affects the entire cosmos. We get these poetic images. Mountains will drip with sweet wine. The deserts will bloom. The wolf and the lamb will lie down together. The natural world, which is currently groaning under the curse, will be totally transformed, culminating in a new heaven and a new earth.
And the critical detail here is the qualitative upgrade of this new paradise compared to the old one. Adam's garden was vulnerable. This new paradise is secure.
That security is paramount. This new creation will be better than the old because of the explicit promise that nothing will ever defile it. The initial vulnerability to the serpent's deceit and influence will be gone. This security is built into the very structure of the new creation, which means a second fall is impossible. The restoration is permanent, not temporary.
And to make that permanent new creation possible, there had to be an internal fix for the people themselves. Because if Adam failed and Israel failed, the problem wasn't the law, it was human capacity. This brings us to the necessity of the new covenant.
The old covenant failed not because the law was flawed, the law was holy and just, but because of the sinful inability of the people to keep it. It led to constant failure and expulsion. The new covenant directly addresses this human failure, this lack of capacity. Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 are crucial here. Yahweh promises two things. First, to forgive their sins completely, removing the guilt. And second, to make a new covenant where his law would be written directly on the hearts of his people.
So the law moves from being an external set of rules written on stone to an internal motivation written on the core of their being.
Exactly. This is the radical nature of the change. It's no longer an external obligation that they struggle against, and this internal transformation is directly connected to the outpouring of the Spirit. The Lord pledges, as Ezekiel says, to put his Spirit within them. The Spirit would indwell their hearts so that they would do His will. The obedience that was a constant failing struggle under the old system becomes a natural internal outflow under the new.
The result is a people who gladly submit to Yahweh's rule. This makes the ultimate restoration possible because the people are finally given the capacity to maintain their relationship with the king.
It guarantees the outcome. The king will have people who are spiritually equipped to live in the undefiled new creation. It transitions the relationship from a conditional contract based on human performance to an unconditional relationship based on God's grace and internal work.
Now we come to what is, for me, the most interesting conceptual synthesis in all the prophetic literature. All these incredible promises, new exodus, new creation, new covenant, the internal transformation, they all become reality only through a single figure who embodies multiple, seemingly disparate roles.
This convergence of the messianic titles is really the great conclusion of the prophetic books. The prophets knew that the sheer magnitude of the promises, restoring the Davidic line, securing global justice, achieving atonement, it required a specific kind of deliverer.
Okay, so let's start with the clearest royal role. The new David, the ruler.
Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah all established that a new David would arise, guaranteeing the perpetuity of the Davidic line despite its temporary failure. He is the shepherd who will rule God's flock with love and selfless care, which is a sharp contrast with the corrupt, self-serving prior shepherds who led Israel astray. This figure restores the royal function that failed with Solomon and his descendants.
And Isaiah provides the characteristics of this king that just elevate him beyond any earthly monarch.
Absolutely. Isaiah 9 confirms the Davidic ruler will be the Spirit-anointed leader of God's people. His titles, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, they signify a king whose wisdom, authority, care, and peaceful reign far exceed anything the world had ever seen. He is not just a man. He carries divine attributes that are necessary to execute global justice.
And that royal function then connects directly to this majestic cosmic figure known as the Son of Man.
This is the critical linkage that Daniel provides. The new David, the king, is intrinsically connected to the vision in Daniel 2 of the stone, cut without hands, that shatters all worldly kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. That royal power is given to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, who is introduced coming on the clouds of heaven to receive everlasting dominion and glory. This links the shepherd-ruler role of the new David to this majestic, authoritative figure who is king and cosmic judge.
But the prophets recognize that ruling over a restored people is impossible unless the fundamental problem, sin and covenant violation, is first removed. A good ruler is not enough. This necessitates the third title, the servant of the Lord, the atoner.
And this is the linchpin. It's the most difficult and glorious realization of the prophetic message. Isaiah makes it plain that the promise of a new exodus, a new creation, will come about only through the mechanism provided by the servant of the Lord. Israel's return from exile requires a mechanism for the forgiveness of sins, a way to absorb the curse that was stipulated back in Deuteronomy 28.
And the sources make it clear that the servant achieves this not through conquering, but through suffering.
Yes, the servant of the Lord bears the sins of the people. He is described as one who is oppressed, afflicted, and cut off from the land of the living. Isaiah 53 provides the shocking detail. He is despised, rejected by men, and wounded for our transgressions. He is the shepherd, as Zechariah describes, who is struck for the sake of the people. The single figure absorbs the entire devastating punishment Israel deserved under the covenant stipulations. Without this substitutionary suffering, there's no forgiveness. Without forgiveness, there's no new covenant, no return, and no undefiled new creation.
So the synthesis is that the new David must also be the suffering servant. The ultimate king must first be the ultimate sacrifice.
The sources affirm that these roles share the same referent. The promises made to Abraham and David, the political, the cosmic, and the redemptive, they all converge in this single figure. The New Testament confirms this synthesis. Jesus is the Son of David, the Messianic King, the Son of Man, the divine judge, and the servant of the Lord, the one who suffered to secure the forgiveness required by the new covenant. This is why the victory is secure. It rests on the suffering and subsequent reign of the king.
Moving from Israel's specific history of failure and restoration, the prophets ensure that the salvation secured by this unified king isn't just for Israel. It has this vast, universal dimension which fulfills the original promise of worldwide blessing made to Abraham way back in Genesis 12.
That scope is absolutely necessary. The blessings were never intended to stop at Israel's borders. Israel was meant to be the conduit for blessing to the world. Judgment looms for those nations and individuals who refuse to submit to the king, but salvation is explicitly promised for Gentiles who put their hope in the Lord and the Davidic king.
And the number of specific examples the prophets provided about the inclusion of Gentiles is just astonishing. This wasn't some tacked-on afterthought. It was central to the prophetic vision of the final kingdom.
It completely reframed Israel's national identity. Malachi 1 states clearly that Yahweh's name will be great among the nations, even in the absence of a perfectly functioning temple in Jerusalem. Isaiah 19 is particularly jarring. It predicts that Egyptians and Assyrians, historic, often bitter enemies, will worship alongside Israel and be called my people. Amos 9 says the remnant of Edom will be called by Yahweh's name. The political and ethnic barriers that define the ancient world will just dissolve under the king's rule.
And the inclusion goes beyond just specific reconciled nations to a broad spiritual outreach across all of humanity.
Joel 2 makes the scope clear, stating that God will pour out his spirit on all people, sons and daughters, old and young, male and female servants. The Spirit is no longer confined just to a prophetic class or to the nation of Israel. The very existence of the book of Jonah, whose message suggests Gentiles in Nineveh can be included, underscores this universal reach. Isaiah speaks directly to the servant's mission outside of Israel's borders.
The servant is intended to be a light for all nations, right?
Correct. The servant will be a light for all nations, and his message will go to the ends of the earth, as stated in Isaiah 42 and 49. Furthermore, Isaiah 2 describes nations streaming to Jerusalem to hear Yahweh's word and learn his ways, turning their instruments of war into tools of agriculture. This vision is of global disarmament and global instruction centered on the king.
And they will even speak a new language, the language of Zion, according to Zephaniah.
Zephaniah 3 promises that Yahweh will change the speech of Gentiles to the pure language of Zion, enabling them all to call upon the name of the Lord together. The cultural and linguistic divisions caused by the Tower of Babel will finally be reversed. All of Abraham's promises will be fulfilled because the blessing will encompass the whole world, securing the global reach of the king's dominion.
And the ultimate final rule for the entire earth is the capstone to this vision of universal inclusion.
Zechariah puts the ultimate conclusion plainly. The Lord will be king over all the earth. The entire world will acknowledge his reign, the judgments due to sin will be removed for those who submit, and the king will be physically present among his redeemed people.
And the ultimate beauty of this fulfillment is tied back to God's presence itself, bringing us full circle from the garden through the tabernacle to the new creation.
The Lord will rule in the new creation, the new Jerusalem and the new temple. But the most beautiful reality of all will not be the architecture or the material blessings. It will be his presence with his people. As Ezekiel 48 concludes the vision of the new city, its defining feature is its name. The Lord is there. They will finally and securely see the King in his beauty, fulfilling the desire for perfect, uninterrupted fellowship with the sovereign Lord.
To really appreciate the necessity of that final vision of the king's beauty and the servant's suffering, we have to look back at the entire trajectory of the story that made such an intervention essential. So let's trace the flow from the very beginning. The garden.
The story starts with God creating Adam and Eve, not just as inhabitants, but as his image bearers and vice-regents. They were created to rule the garden and the world for his glory, acting as faithful subordinate rulers. Their rule was conditional on submitting to God's own authority.
And they failed at that rule by listening to the serpent, attempting to seize knowledge and authority outside of God's framework.
That failure resulted in the fall, bringing sin, death, and the curse into the world. But immediately, the Lord provides the foundational promise of future victory through conflict. The offspring of the woman would triumph over the offspring of the serpent, though the deliverer would first be struck. This set the entire trajectory of the subsequent narrative.
And the conflict started immediately outside of Eden.
It did. The failure of Adam's vice-regency was replicated in his immediate descendants. Cain, acting as the offspring of the serpent, killed Abel, symbolizing the ongoing warfare against the line of promise. The wickedness increased exponentially until, by the time of Noah, the entire world, save one family, was aligned against God's lordship.
The flood served as a major historical judgment, anticipating the final judgment. The covenant with Noah, then, it promises preservation rather than total renewal.
It was a guarantee of cosmic stability. The covenant with Noah promised to spare the world from future water judgments, preserving the human race until the ultimate victory could be achieved. This preservation was necessary because human hearts hadn't changed, as we see immediately demonstrated by the collective hubris at the Tower of Babel, where humans again tried to establish their own kingdom and live for their own glory instead of God's.
And this global failure then sets the stage for the calling of Abraham and the focusing of the promise.
In an act of pure grace, God called Abraham, pledging land, offspring, and universal blessing. The offspring of Abraham was meant to be the line that would eventually produce the deliverer who would defeat the serpent. Yet Abraham and Sarah waited years for a single child, Isaac. And by the end of Genesis, the promised offspring totaled only about 70 people.
The delay was itself a teaching mechanism that highlighted human frailty.
It taught that the victory over the serpent would be arduous and long, and that its timing rested entirely on God's sovereign control, not on human effort or reproduction.
So the Exodus finally saw the offspring promise begin to flourish into a great nation, but it also introduced a clear prototype of the serpent's offspring in the form of Pharaoh.
Pharaoh tried to destroy Israel through genocide and oppression, but Yahweh reigned as king and warrior, securing the first Exodus and leading his people to the land, the second great promise, the new Garden of Eden. The entire purpose of the Exodus was to establish that Israel was Yahweh's people, redeemed to live under his direct authority.
And the conditions for remaining in that new Eden were laid out explicitly at Sinai.
The Mosaic covenant required strict adherence to its stipulations. Israel was a kingdom of priests, meant to show the surrounding nations what life under God's rule looked like. But they needed to learn what it meant for a holy God to dwell in their midst. If they failed to obey, they would be evicted from the land, just as Adam was expelled from the original Eden. And the pattern of failure repeats itself immediately in the wilderness.
Right. The tabernacle ensured God's presence, making Israel distinct, but it also underscored the constant, pervasive nature of human uncleanness.
Access to the Holy King was not free and unhindered. Sacrifices and designated priests were necessary because human beings were unclean due to sin. The failure was so constant that the entire generation that left Egypt perished in the wilderness because they refused to trust the Lord and obey his commands.
Moving through the timeline, the period of Judges shows Israel just oscillating perpetually between brief moments of trust and these long, extended periods of idolatry. The need for a stable, permanent king became undeniably apparent.
The cycle in Judges: sin, oppression, cry out, temporary savior, judge. It showed that the people required a permanent deliverer and shepherd. The promise of kingship, which was always part of the plan, now became the focus. Victory over the serpent would come through a king from David's line.
But the rise of Saul, the first king, was a false dawn.
Saul was the prototype of human failure, replicating the failure of Adam and Israel. He started well, but his character flaws and disobedience led him to turn aside to evil. Ultimately, he proved himself to be another example of the offspring of the serpent, prioritizing his own glory over God's command. So the kingdom was removed from his line.
David, however, was anointed as a contrast, a man who, despite his personal failures, possessed a core trust and obedience to the Lord.
And because of that trust, David was granted a permanent dynasty. The promised deliverer would come from his line. Under David and Solomon, Israel seemed poised to achieve worldwide blessing. The temple was built and they were safe in the land. This was the pinnacle of their earthly glory.
But even the high point of the monarchy couldn't overcome the issue of human sin and the failure of vice-regency.
David stumbled badly, and Solomon's defection into idolatry was so severe that the kingdom divided after his death. Ultimately, both Judah and Israel violated the covenant to such an extent that the prophets pronounced the inevitable judgment. They were sent into exile. The temple, the place of Yahweh's presence, was destroyed, and they were evicted from their Eden, confirming the prophetic insight that the covenant curses are absolute.
So the narrative moves from initial creation and failure through covenant warning to the ultimate consequence of judgment. The prophets then provide the final conclusion. The demise was covenant judgment, but the promise of a new exodus, new creation, and new covenant, all realized through the unified new Davidson of manservant, remains the certain future, even if its fullness is delayed.
And the non-narrative books, the Songs of Israel and the Wisdom tradition, they don't interrupt this storyline at all. The source material shows they fit perfectly within the overall theme of God's reign and the eventual triumph of the king. They examine the practical realities of living under Yahweh's rule in the interim between Adam's failure and the new David's arrival.
Okay, so let's start with the Psalms, the Songs of Israel. The central theme of the Psalter is clearly stated: the Lord reigns.
And the structure of the Psalter itself mirrors the history we just reviewed, which reinforces the unity of the OT story. Its 5 books move chronologically, from the high point of David's reign and initial glory in Book 1, through the confusion and experience of exile in Book 4, to the eventual renewal of the Davidic promise and the anticipation of God's cosmic rule in Book 5. It fits the central theme that God will destroy the serpent's reign through a Davidic king.
And the Psalter culminates in this powerful expression of praise tied to the king's presence.
Yes, the final movement of the Psalter is just an explosion of praise, reinforcing that the ultimate goal of restoration is dwelling securely with the king. The songs instruct Israel how to live, how to worship, and how to lament while waiting for the full arrival of the promised kingdom.
Then we have wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. These might seem like philosophical deviations, but the sources see them as complementary perspectives on what it looks like to live righteously under God's dominion.
They all share the same anchor point. The fear of the Lord is the heart of wisdom. These books integrate faith with the concrete details of everyday life: how to conduct business, how to raise children, how to speak carefully. They draw heavily on creation traditions, assuming a moral order built into the cosmos by the king.
So Proverbs provides the ordinary, predictable pattern of blessing in this divinely ordered cosmos.
Proverbs tells us that ordinarily, those who fear the Lord and follow his commands will experience prosperity, safety, and a good life. It describes the general rule, what happens most of the time when wisdom is applied. But the sources warn against a simplistic transactional appropriation of that message, because Job and Ecclesiastes address the exceptions and anomalies.
Right. Those books introduce the necessary balance, human limitation, and the mystery of God's reign in a fallen world.
They teach that life is often mysterious, baffling, and, frankly, absurd for those living under the sun. Job shows that suffering is not always a consequence of personal sin. Ecclesiastes shows that striving for meaning outside of fearing God is utterly frustrating. Humans lack the capacity to discern the full rationale of God's reign. The call is to fear and submit, understanding that suffering is a reality that cannot always be avoided or explained by a simple equation of righteousness equals prosperity. But the ultimate outcome is secure, and there's a startling canonical connection made about the definition of the truly wise man.
The ultimate integrated call is for human beings to fear the Lord and obey him, trusting that even if we can't fathom the mysteries of existence in this age, it will go well for those who submit to his rule. And the sources connect this back to the king. From a canonical perspective, the only truly wise person who invariably lived righteously by fearing the Lord and keeping his commands, the perfect Adam, the perfect Israel, the perfect king, is Jesus Christ. He is the standard that the wisdom books anticipate. And finally, the Song of Songs, which seems purely focused on human romance, is integrated by connecting it to Eden and the new creation.
It serves a dual purpose. On one level, it celebrates married love, comparing its pleasures and innocence to the original, unblemished intimacy of Eden before the fall. But it also points outward, anticipating the deeper, permanent love and union between the King, Christ, and his redeemed people, the Church, showing that the book anticipates a permanent reality of union secured by the new covenant, a relationship that transcends temporary human experience.
We need to return now to that crucial gap in the storyline, the anticlimax of the return from exile. The source material refers to this as the already but not yet reality, which is essential for understanding the transition to the New Testament.
This is a critical tension that the post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, they force their audience to confront. After reading the glorious visions in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, you would expect the return from Babylon to immediately usher in the new creation, with the curse lifted and the king established.
But that's not what happened at all. The reality was a low ebb, marked by discouragement.
Israel did return, as promised, fulfilling the new Exodus in part. But the fullness of the promises was clearly not realized. They rebuilt the temple, but the structure scarcely matched Solomon's glory and was nothing like the temple that Ezekiel foresaw, which was this massive spiritual structure. Jerusalem lacked the freedom and political influence of Solomon's day. They were still vassals under Persian, then Greek, then Roman rule.
So it was a partial restoration that left Israel waiting. And Daniel explains why this waiting period would be longer than Israel expected.
Daniel's visions show that the period between the return from exile and the arrival of God's kingdom would involve the rise and fall of several successive, powerful world kingdoms. This revealed that the victory over the serpent was delayed, requiring patience and sustained faith from God's people. The people were still looking for the king to arrive and finally set up his rule.
So what lesson should the listener take from this extended delay, this realization that the restoration began, but the curse was still active?
The slowness of the triumph is not an accident of history or a failure of God's will. It's designed to bring glory to God by revealing the depth and breadth of human sin, highlighting why the covenant failure was so complete. It shows how utterly dependent the people must be on the coming king, It underscores the sheer miracle of God's grace that persists despite that continuous human failure and the deferred hope.
So the people were therefore called to live with deferred hope, following the Lord even while waiting for the ultimate salvation.
They were called to continue to follow the Lord, trusting that the kingdom would come in its fullness. The promise of the new David, who suffers and rules, was reiterated, not rejected, even during this long, difficult period of waiting. The OT story concludes with the people back in the land, but still longing for the king to bring the final cosmic victory.
This has been a complete circuit of the Old Testament story, establishing a clear line from creation to expectation. The exile was the inevitable covenant judgment, but the subsequent restoration demonstrates that God's sovereign plan cannot be frustrated by human sin. The return was slow, but the hope of a new David who suffers and rules remains utterly certain.
And the major insight we can draw from this comprehensive narrative is that the entire OT story is designed to bring glory to God. It reveals the depth of human sin alongside the miracle of God's grace. It shows that the entire history is heading toward the reign of the King, who will bring about new creation and new covenant.
And critically, we saw that the ultimate victory over the serpent required the new David to fulfill the role of the servant. He had to suffer for the people's sins, absorbing the punishment they deserved. That substitutionary element is the only thing that secures the new paradise.
If the king had merely come as a powerful ruler, as the new David or Son of Man, he could have conquered Rome, but he could not have redeemed Israel from its covenant failure or secured the permanent, undefiled new creation. Forgiveness of sin, the very prerequisite for entering that new creation, required his suffering. This is the cornerstone of the whole prophetic argument.
So we leave you with this question for reflection. We have seen the incredible weight of the covenant where Adam failed, Israel failed, and the consequence was expulsion and death. If the ultimate victory over the serpent required the new David to suffer for the people's sins, absorbing the punishment they deserved, what practical difference should it make in your daily life to know that the new paradise, where the king is in his beauty, is a reality secured not by your obedience, but by his substitutionary suffering?